Hi, my name's Richard Landis. I'm a professor of history at Boston University. I got my doctorate at Princeton in medieval history. I became interested in, after publishing a number of books in medieval history, 10th, 11th century France. I got involved in a project following various kinds of millennial or messianic movements. Just came out with a book called Heaven on Earth, The Varieties of the Millennial Experience, that basically develops a topology and approach to studying these movements and their impact in history. Um, and as a result of working on that, got involved in tracking global jihad as an apocalyptic millennial movement. That is, as a movement that believes that it's time for Islam to conquer the world, and it's going to happen in this generation. And as a result, since 2000 in particular, I've been tracking global jihad as an apocalyptic millennial movement and also tracking the West's response to it, which has not been very good, and which this series is about. Thank you. I am working on a project that started as a result of the historical work that I did. I am a medievalist trained to work in a period that's pre-modern, and that in particular, as I've come to understand over time and come to overcome my own tendency to project my mentality back onto the past, actually was governed by a different set of cultural rules, which I think for short we can safely call the rules of honor and shame, in which the most important thing is to have honor and to keep honor. The most important thing is to not lose honor and to restore honor largely through acts of vengeance. So what you get in an honor shame culture, at least for the alpha males, is a culture in which it is not only accepted and even expected, but it's required that you shed someone's blood in order to restore your honor and for the sake of honor. You have to shed blood for the sake of honor. In Japan, for example, it can be your own blood. You restore your honor by committing seppuku. But in most cultures, it's shedding somebody else's blood. And that's in strong contrast to the kind of society that we live in, which is one in which we, as much as possible, we try and resolve conflicts through a discourse of equity, including law courts that operate according to a discourse of equity, as a way of managing the inevitable conflicts that happen in human society. So for a long time I studied the Middle Ages. I came to understand the role of honor-shame in the behavior, particularly of the political elites, the aristocracy, but also of the church, and even of the commoners and the peasantry and so on. And then comes the 21st century, and I discovered that we live in a society in which people are so accustomed to the new rules, to the non-honor shame rules, which doesn't mean that we don't care about honor shame, but they don't play the same role. We're so accustomed to this world that when we're faced with an enemy, which is essentially out of the Middle Ages. It's an enemy that believes a religious message in which they have to dominate everyone else. That's what their understanding is of what God wants from them. And therefore, any form of coercion, including direct attacks and murder and torture and inquisition and you name it, any form of violence is perfectly legitimate to establish and restore the honor of their religion. And what I discovered is that we're not equipped to even understand this because we've gone so far beyond this. We're so far into the separation of church and state that we almost can't understand people who are still attached to having state and church together, using the state to impose the demands of the church. In this case, we're talking about Islam and the demands of Sharia. Now what I do is I work on how to fight back against this, not so much in the physical realm, but on the cognitive level, in terms of how do we understand what we're facing and how do we respond effectively to this. And I think that a great deal of the resistance to this basically very primitive medieval and even pre-medieval, but let's say medieval religious movement, a holy war, can actually be won in the cognitive plane, in the realm of discussion, in the public sphere, without the use of violence. So one of the greatest problems that we face is a notion that's described by psychologists as cognitive egocentrism. The psychiatrist who first coined the term was working with teenage boys who, not surprisingly, could think of nothing but sex. What interested him was that they assumed that everybody else shared their obsession. So this tendency to project your own mindset onto other people is called cognitive egocentrism. We have a sort of double form of this, which actually ends up being what I call the Mobius strip of cognitive egocentrism. And that is to say that on the one hand, we have Westerners who were trained in a liberal positive sum tradition in which the idea is win-win. And therefore, as much as possible, you try and find solutions that in which there's something for everybody. And you assume that if you're nice to people, they'll be nice to you. And that people are basically good unless proven not good. But by and large, modern civil society actually depends on the idea that we are generous with each other and we give each other the benefit of the doubt. And we treat each other decently and expect to be treated decently in return. As a result, we tend to project this onto people who don't necessarily share this point of view. Now, the other point of view, which we could call a zero-sum mentality, is one in which everything is a zero-sum game. Everything is I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. If you win anything, I lose. It's not just if you win something. So literally a positive sum game registers in the mind of the zero-sum game player as a loss. Anything you win is a loss for me. And so as a result, people who come from cultures in which most interactions, particularly with strangers and outsiders, is a zero-sum game, have a tendency to project the same mentality onto other people. So they assume that even when we're playing positive-sum games, we are in fact playing zero-sum games. So that if we come up with a solution in which there's something in it for us and there's something in it for them, they view that as an effort to beat them and to win in this zero-sum game. So as a result, when you get that mutual projection in which we liberal cognitive egocentrists, positive-sum cognitive egocentrists, project our attitude onto people who are playing zero-sum games, and zero-sum cognitive egocentrists project onto us that we're playing zero-sum games, generally the side that's playing the zero-sum game wins. Probably the best example of this was the Oslo peace process, in which, on the one hand, the whole formula, land for peace, is a notion of a positive sum. The Israelis get peace, the Palestinians get their own state, they get the land. And as a result, everybody should be happy. But in fact, from the point of view of the Palestinians, who wanted it all and who could only win if Israel lost, any victory on the part of the Israelis was a loss. And as a result, even though there were generous concessions made by the Israelis, including dividing Jerusalem, made at the Camp David talks, the answer from Yasser Arafat was no. Now, one of the ways that you see cognitive egocentrism at work is that immediately thereafter, a number of pro-Palestinian figures in the West tried to explain why Yasser Arafat said no, not in terms of his zero-sum game with the Israelis, but on the contrary, to insist that if only the Israelis had given more, then he would have said yes. That he was perfectly willing to play positive-sum games, but Israel didn't give enough as far as he was concerned. Of course, there is a really interesting question here, which is, just how long are you going to have your people suffer stateless in order to get every last concession you can get? But in general, the attitude was, if only Israel gave more, then things would work. And that sort of positive-sum notion that Israel should make more concessions is one of the guiding figures in the way in which our cognitive egocentrism repeatedly, when it confronts the zero-sum attitude of people from, in this case, the Palestinians, but more broadly, I'd say people from Muslim cultures, our attitude is, by and large, if it doesn't work, then there's something more that we have to do. So cognitive egocentrism can actually lead to what I call masochistic omnipotence syndrome, which is, it's all our fault. If only we were nicer, if only we gave more, if only we made more concessions, then things would work. And if things don't work, it must be our fault. So on the one hand, you have this masochism of always blaming yourself, and on the other hand, you have this omnipotence fantasy in which you are responsible for everything that goes right or wrong. And it completely robs the Palestinians or whoever we're in conflict with, it robs them of their agency. They are no longer viewed as moral agents who make decisions. They're viewed merely as people who are reacting to the things that we do. And if we change, they will change, and there's no problem. And, one of the things that we find, and this illustrates how the Mobius strip of cognitive egocentrism works to the advantage of the zero-sum players, is every time Israel makes a concession, it's taken by the zero-sum players as a sign of weakness, not as a sign of generosity. We in the West think that when we make concessions, when we grant people things, we're being generous. But on the other hand, from their point of view, from the zero-sum cognitive egocentrist point of view, all of these concessions are forms of weakness that show that we are desperate, we are not capable of fighting for what we want, and therefore we're trying to cajole them. And they take it as a sign of weakness, which calls forth further aggression. And we saw this with the Camp David Accord. We saw this in northern Lebanon when Israel withdrew, in southern Lebanon when Israel withdrew from there in 2000. And we saw it again in 2005 when Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip. And almost immediately, the rocketing of Israel intensified. So in all of these cases, we're dealing with a situation in which our unwillingness to recognize that there's a different mindset, that we're dealing with people who play by a different set of rules and interpret gestures in a radically different way. And as a result, we can see that in certain cases, when we refuse to overcome our cognitive egocentrism, when we refuse to acknowledge that there are people out there who are playing by a different set of rules and interpret gestures differently, we're the ones who lose. One of the issues that comes up, and it's a very difficult one to deal with, is the attitude towards violence in a society. So, for example, one of the ways that we hear the expression all the time, senseless violence. I think most recently I remember hearing it about the Charlie Hebdo attack in France, in which jihadis broke into the headquarters of Charlie Hebdo and killed 19 journalists for having done pictures making fun of the Prophet. And so John Kerry and I think President Obama both referred to it as senseless violence. Now, in a modern culture, all violence is senseless. But in an honor shame, in a pre-modern culture, to say senseless violence is not a tautology, like violence, all violence is senseless, but in fact it's an oxymoron. All violence is meaningful. There is no such thing as senseless violence, and certainly for the people who carried it out, for the the jihadis who carried it out, this was very sensible violence. It had meaning. It had a direct meaning, which was, don't you dare, you Westerners, you infidels, don't you dare publish a picture of the Prophet. And so when there was a Guardian journalist who came to give a talk, and I went to listen to his talk, and he's explaining how the Guardian and others chose not to show the picture of the front cover of the Charlie Hebdo after the massacre, which was unquestionably a news item. And he said, well, we didn't do it out of fear. We did it out of sensitivity for the feelings of Muslims, which is, you know, the same thing, because the sensibility of Muslims, particularly of jihadis, is that if you violate them, you can get killed. So of course you're going to be sensitive to that. Are you sensitive to the feelings of Christians when you do, you show a picture of an artwork of Christ in a jar of piss? You're not worried about them. They're not going to attack you. So, you know, on the one hand, you have this sort of moralizing, modern, we're generous, we don't, you know, gratuitously want to offend anybody, and so on and so forth, telling themselves that they're doing this voluntarily, that it's all part of this positive-sum world in which we'll be nice to them and they'll be nice to us. And on the other side, you have people engaged in not senseless violence, but meaningful violence, and getting precisely the results that they intend to get. So it's a good example of how when you have these two mentalities crisscrossing, you get agreement to the detriment of the positive-sum players. Now, I think one of the most striking things that got to me once in class was there was a discussion of two books, one by Christopher Browning called Ordinary Men, and it was about the 101st Police Battalion, German Police Battalion, which was basically after the conquest of Poland in charge of keeping order in Poland. And they were the ones who first received the orders to go into Jewish ghettos, communities, whatever, towns, and just round everybody up and shoot them at point-blank range. Men, women, children, old people, sick people, shoot them all. And then there was another book that dealt with the same archive of documents. There was a trial in the 60s, same archive of documents by Daniel Goldhagen in a book called Willing Executioners. And it was sort of, you know, on the one hand, Browning is saying, look, you know, they were offered the opportunity not to do it, but most of them did it because of the peer pressure and because it was difficult to say no. And even though they could say no and nobody was punished for saying no, they all agreed to, but they were reluctant and they felt forced into it. And he basically draws a picture in which at the end he can say, look, which of us can say for sure that we wouldn't be somebody who would get caught up in that machinery? Now, personally, I like to think of myself as somebody who, if told to shoot men, women, and children, there's no way I would do it. But okay, so, but Goldhagen goes in and looks at the same documents and comes out with ample evidence of eagerness to do that. Willing executioners, including sadistic behavior and, you know, volunteering to go above and beyond the call of duty to track down Jews who got away and kill them and so on. So he draws a very different picture, not of reluctant Germans, but in fact the fact that only 5% of them accepted the opportunity not to do this shows really, you know, terrible abilities to stand up to the multitude to do evil. So I say to my students, you know, and Goldhagen's got evidence that clearly either Browning didn't see or didn't want to talk about because it didn't fit his thesis, but all the stuff about the sadism, the fact that there are women there who are encouraging them and so on, and it's really, it's an awful picture. And so I said to my students, well, which do you think is the better historian? So one of them says, I prefer Browning. And I said, why? And she said, well, because I think that Goldhagen dehumanizes them. And I said, how does he dehumanize them? She said, well, he depicts them as sadistic. Now, at that point I said, isn't sadism a particular human trait? I mean, what animal do we know that's sadistic? And she had to grant me that. But overall, her attitude was one of, look, we're all just good people here. And so let's not depict people as being mean. That's not nice to depict people as being mean. And so there's this kind of niceness that projects what sort of the best of what we want of ourselves onto a past event, which was unquestionably sort of, the measuring stick for evil. And here she's saying, well, let's not dehumanize these guys. And they weren't even Nazis. Most of these people weren't members of the party. They were just, German policemen who got sent to Poland to man the gates. Anyway, so I think those are two good examples of the way in which we fail to understand what we're dealing with. I would say, and this is a term that others have used as well, that there's a kind of moral narcissism going on here, that we want to feel good about ourselves. We want to feel that we're good people, and good people don't suspect other people of being bad. Because, among other things, if you come to the conclusion that somebody is bad, then you have to oppose them. So as long as you accept whatever somebody says as being bona fides, you don't have to oppose them. And if you're afraid of them, you want a lot of good excuses not to oppose them. So this desire to feel good about ourselves actually can be very dangerous. I think it's a very dangerous trait right now because it covers for cowardice. It covers for not confronting really bad stuff by insisting that it isn't really bad, and doing it on the principle of, heavens forbid that I should suspect somebody else of being a bad person. Liberals have a very serious problem, and that problem is that they've adopted a set of rules. Let's call them positive sum rules. They've adopted a set of positive sum rules and the attitudes that go along with it, which is, to look generously towards other people, to rejoice in their success as well as your own success, to not try and make yourself look bigger by making other people look smaller. All of these things are part of a liberal ethos, to let other people be free so that you can be free. And they all work when they are encountering people willing to be played by those rules. So when you get a critical mass, and I'll leave the critical mass undefined, but when you get a critical mass of people who are ready to move over, not to, doing this all the time, but I would say even, if they're batting .333, if a third of their interactions with others are positive sum, then you can try launching a democracy. You can try launching a society that grants its people the freedom to act responsibly, rather than telling them what to do, as in a traditional society. But what happens is, when a society that's working really well according to these principles, and being very productive and innovative and reforming things, trying to improve things and so on, modern democracies, when they encounter a culture that is really dedicated to a zero-sum ethos, it is not only difficult for them to see it, let's say, again, from the moral narcissism, it's not only difficult for them to see it, but they almost can't afford to see it. They need the other side to be ready to play their game. They fall into the trap of masochistic omnipotence syndrome. And what that means is that it's all our fault, and if only we could do better, everything would be all right. So if my positive sum overtures to this person from a different culture aren't working, then it's my fault, not their fault. And as a result, if I can be better, then they will respond appropriately, which ultimately takes all agency away from the other side. Everything's a function of me. If things are good, it's because I'm doing good. If things are bad, it's because I'm doing bad. The other person really isn't an agent. Which is a deep flaw in this kind of thinking. But in any case, it's very tempting to engage in this kind of thinking, because when we run up against real hostility, you know, like 9/11, there were some people who said, what's wrong with this society that they produce people like this? And there were other people who said, what did we do wrong that they hate us so? Now, it's important to ask, have I done something wrong? Fact is that, you know, when it comes to infidels' treatment of Muslims, historically speaking, America has probably the best record of any Western nation. Right? The French, the English have slaughtered and tortured and conquered millions of Muslims. British in India, the French in Algeria, and so on. Really nasty stuff. Nothing compared to what Americans have done to Muslims. So the idea that what we did is why they hate us is a perfect example of this kind of this liberal paradox of not being able to let go of both your sense of yourself as a good person, and therefore you are obliged to treat everybody else as a good person. And this leads to, you know, a major way in which human rights organizations in particular are enormously they're enormously vulnerable to the appeal of what I call demopaths. A demopath is somebody who will use the language of democracy, civil rights, human rights, humanity, all of this as a way to appeal for their own rights, when in fact, in any case where it's up to them to grant rights to other people, they don't do it at all. So they're not committed to these values. They use them in order to, in the words of one practitioner of the art, use democracy to destroy democracy. Now, liberals don't want to believe that anybody would want to destroy democracy, because we all agree it's the best system in the world. We like it. So if only other people understood, they'd like it, and certainly we're more successful, so everybody wants to be like us, so we must be the right thing. So they can't believe that we actually have enemies. We actually have people who would like to destroy the democracies that we've created. And as a result, we feel almost obliged morally not to question their bona fides, not to say, are you lying? Not to challenge them and say, wait a minute, you want this kind of recognition of your rights, and are you willing to grant the same thing to somebody else? And then you find out that for a variety of reasons, they're not. And the question is, you know, can you hold the line, or are you going to buckle under and say, oh, well, if you don't want to extend those rights to this person because they've done you a wrong, and you're so convinced that they've done you that wrong that they're guilty and you have a right to destroy them, I have to go along with that? Well, the liberal finds himself compelled to concede the argument, to concede to the narrative. The victim's narrative has priority. So you go from a system where in tribal society it's my side, right or wrong. My side, if my cousin got in a fight with somebody else, I don't care whether it was his fault that the fight was started, I'm on his side. He's my boy. So my side, right or wrong, and your side, always wrong. Civil society, civil polities, democracies, a discourse of equity and fairness arises when you say, whoever is right, my side or not. Now, that's not always easy to do, and, you know, it's perfectly normal for people every once in a while when it's really deeply felt like family that you say my side right or wrong. It's not 100% whoever's right, but that's what courts are there for, to decide, and we accept the decisions of the courts even if we don't like them. But now we have this postmodern liberal paradoxical variant which says their side right or wrong, my side always wrong. So if they claim that we've done terrible things to them, then it's our obligation to accept the accusation. And you end up with a kind of a marriage of pre-modern sadism and postmodern masochism. You end up with people saying, you've done terrible things to my people, I hate your guts and I want to destroy you, and I'm so furious that I want to blow up your twin towers and kill as many of you civilians as I can, and it enrages me that you are still around because you're so awful. And we say, you're right, I'm sorry. So, that's not the kind of dialogue we should be having in this situation. And yet, because liberals can't challenge people they feel that historically their ancestors have wronged, for a variety of reasons, all of which need to be examined and confronted, but this constant concession, this constant effort to placate the other, to say, yes, 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 I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, now can we get on with our lives? And the fact is that for them, getting on there with their lives is destroying us. So we're not getting where we think we're getting. We're, in fact, from their point of view, behaving exactly as they would have us behave, namely as intimidated people who concede all of their aggressions. So we get into this situation which we're in now, in which, at least according to my analysis, we've been in since 2000. I date the moment at which we started losing to an onslaught, a jihadi onslaught, back to October 2000. And in October 2000, we had what I call the collapse of the cultural Maginot Line. In other words, civil society has all kinds of ways of defending itself from the aggressions of pre-modern personalities, of people who believe that they should be able to dominate and to use force to dominate, and if people they don't like get in their way, they should have the right to be able to eliminate them, which was the pre-modern political model. I mean, it was hemmed in here and there, but by and large, the aristocracy was able to intimidate the rest of the population across the board. In fact, you could call the sort of class consciousness, for instance, which went out with the American Revolution, of what's known as cap deference, which is if you wear a cap, you're a manual laborer. If you wear a hat, then you're a gentleman. And so if you're a manual laborer and if you're wearing a cap and you meet somebody with a hat, you have to doff your cap to show respect to this person who is inherently superior to you. So there are all sorts of ways to defend against this kind of stuff, and some of them are just the normal kinds of things. Whereas if somebody starts behaving like a European aristocrat in America, most people will just laugh at it. That's not going to be a particularly successful form of behavior. But if you've got mafiosi and so on who are willing to use force and to intimidate people, they can have some success. Now, in principle, there are ways to get at this. And culturally, there are ways to deal with this. And what happened in 2000 was that sort of across the boards, there was a collapse of the Maginot Line against a jihadi aggression, in which various places, various key areas of the Western public sphere, like schools, like universities, like journalists, and so on, were in fact aggressed by jihadis and behaved with placation and intimidation and didn't resist. So, for example, the key moment in this turnaround, this bascule, as the French would say, this flipping of the lines of force, occurred with the outbreak of the Second Intifada in 2000. And at that point, you have journalists who are not depicting what's actually going on, but in fact depicting an extensive, staged presentation of Palestinians being killed by ruthless Israelis. So in 2000, what you have is journalists who are reporting essentially Palestinian war propaganda as news to the West. And you have violent responses in the West, including the spread of some really vile anti-Semitic language, not just anti-Israel language, but anti-Semitic. So, for instance, in the French schools, the term, they play around and they use this sort of reverse word order or reverse spelling order for words. So, for instance, juif, which means Jew, is feuge, which is juif backwards, and Arab is beurre, which also means butter. So, so in the French schools at this point, juif feuge became literally a synonym for bad. So if you gave somebody said, "Can I borrow your pen?" and you said, "No, c'est un pic feuge," it's a Jew pen. It means it's broken. It doesn't work. And this just spread at lightning speed, and nobody was in a position to resist it. So there were demands, for example, that teachers shouldn't be discussing the Holocaust in school because it offended Muslim students. There were Jewish kids being beaten up, and they would go to the principal, and the principal would suggest that they take their kid out of the school, which meant that their school had a triumphant bully running the place. So it was a loss for everybody except for the bullies. And this happened across the line. Now, I say this because we have to understand that the attack that's being made is an attack on a democratic culture that makes progressive values possible, that it makes it possible to be a liberal. You can't be a liberal in many places in the world. You can try, and we've got volunteers all over the world who are trying to do that. The amount of their success, from reports that I've heard from Haiti, is very limited because it's not easy to transfer these kinds of traits. So we're in a situation where we are literally handing over to people who want to destroy it the very cultural framework that makes our desires to be good people, to be liberals, to help society progress, to help people get along with each other without violence, to help people to be free and to live fulfilling lives. All of these things are in some sense being imperiled by the way in which we are not dealing with the kind of challenges that we can make as a democratic culture to the demopaths who come to destroy us. Where does all this discussion get us? I think it gets us in a position to start understanding a phenomenon that we desperately need to understand, and that by and large we are almost obtuse about. We literally look away from most of the manifestations because they make us feel uncomfortable, and because they put us in situations where we don't know what to do, and the options that are immediately apparent to us are not the kind of options that we as good people would like to engage in, namely, really opposing potentially in a violent conflict people of another faith and another culture. So it comes down to a critical issue that we have yet to think about, and I think you'll understand as I explain why it's so difficult for us to think about it. And that is the question of what is a genuine moderate and what is a false moderate amongst Muslims in the West today. We'll leave the Muslims and the rest of the world out for the time being. We're talking about people who live in France, in Germany, in England, in the United States, in New Zealand, in various democracies, Spain, you name it, Italy, most of Western Europe, and so on. Muslims in these countries, how many of them are moderate, and what does moderate mean, and how many of them are what we might call false moderates, which is to say that they're not actually committed to moderation. Moderation is a garb that they wear to disguise themselves so that they will be acceptable to us. But in fact, they're pursuing the same goal with a different strategy than the violent jihadis, namely the dominance of Islam the world over. The most immediate problem in the early 21st century, as far as I can make out, is the problem of global jihad. And global jihad is a religious movement, an Islamic religious movement, based on the Islamic principle that Islam is the superior, the only and the superior religion on the planet, and that everybody should either become a Muslim or be subject to Muslim law, known as Sharia. And whether you want to call it the global caliphate or you want to call it global Sharia, the problem that we are faced with today is that there is a movement, and we don't even know how big it is, but we certainly know that in some places it's very strong. There is a movement in which the ultimate goal is the conquest of the world. Now, again, this is one of the problems for liberal cognitive egocentrists, you know. You sound like you're demonizing somebody. That's what the Nazis said about the Jews. They wanted to conquer the world. It was their warrant for genocide, in the very words of Norman Cohn, who wrote the first major book on the Protocols of the Elder Society. So here you are accusing other people of wanting to conquer the world. Aren't you behaving like Nazis? Aren't you using hate speech? Now, the problem is that in some cases, people do want to conquer the world, and in other cases they don't. And so if you falsely accuse somebody of wanting to conquer the world, that is a terribly serious problem. On the other hand, if you accuse people of wanting to conquer the world and they themselves say that that is their goal, which incidentally Hitler said, if that's the case, then you have to take them seriously. You can't take the attitude that says, well, they don't really mean that. Or, I'm not listening, I don't hear you. So, in this case, I think we have to take these people very seriously. They do want to conquer the world. Will they succeed? Certainly, I hope not. And at least up until 2000, I thought there was no chance. Now I think they actually have a shot at it. But in any case, the point is that until we take them seriously, their shot grows stronger. We must take them seriously. So here's our problem. On the one hand, we can identify certain people who are unquestionably in the we want to conquer the world and will do it whatever way necessary, including the most violent means, and attacking and wanting to kill millions of infidels. And heretics as well, and that's certainly Al-Qaeda, and that's ISIS, and that's, most people don't know, but it's also Hamas, and it's Hezbollah, and a whole range of movements, Boko Haram, some of which are household words and some of which are not, but there's a whole range of these movements. These are clearly the extremists. They clearly want to conquer the world for Islam. Now there's another group, and this is the more problematic group, who say, no, we don't want to conquer the world for Islam, but in fact do everything they can to advance that agenda, including to protect as much as possible the actual violent jihadis, but who also conduct campaigns in our public sphere, in our universities, with our journalists and so on, to get them to comply with the demands. Because the fact is that you don't have to be conquered to become a dhimmi, to become one of the protected groups, or the blameworthy protected groups in Islam. What you have to do is submit. So if you already start behaving as a dhimmi, as a submitted one, then there's no reason for them to have to actually use violence against you, as long as you comply with their demands. These are the people we have to identify. These are the people we have to say no to. These are the people that we have to realize are not dealing with us fairly. They're not dealing with us honestly. They are, in fact, with bad motive. And again, that's a terribly hard thing for us to do, particularly when we're dealing with somebody face to face. We don't want to believe they're of bad motive. So that issue, the issue of what is, if we define a genuine moderate as somebody who is willing, even when he's in a position of strength, to treat the others the way he wishes to be treated when he's not in a position of strength. If that's our definition of moderate, I would give it as a definition of liberal. I would give it as a definition of citizen in a democracy. If that's our definition of moderate, how many moderates do we find among Muslims? And even more importantly, how many of these do we find among Muslim leaders? How many of their leaders are being straight with us? And I think that unless we start asking these questions, and unless we start pushing back, we are basically being told to lie down and accept their dominion. And if we don't resist it, that's exactly what we're going to end up doing. And it's to fighting that, to fighting back, to fighting for a world in which both Muslims and, as they call us, infidels, both Muslims and infidels are free, and not a world in which Muslims are free to dominate infidels. So, for example, 1,000 years ago, let's take the year 1000 as a point, the Muslim world was part of the first world with China, and possibly you could argue, although it was already fading, Eastern Christianity in Constantinople. By and large, the Arab world was a new member of the first world and a particularly vigorous member of the first world. The Arab world, and more broadly the Muslim world, which was largely dominated by Arabs. So here you have a situation where Islam in its early period is enormously successful on a global scale, literally unseen by any movement before. And as a result, they were extremely proud of their tradition, and they developed a number of notions that built up that pride, including the way they treated conquered peoples. If they were idol worshippers, then they would be killed. If they were Christians or Jews, then they had what's called the status of dhimmi, spelled D-H-I-M-M-I, which literally means blameworthy, and they're blameworthy because they haven't accepted Islam, but is often translated today as protected. But you have to understand that's protected in the sense of a protection racket. In other words, as long as they accepted their status as inferior, as long as they accepted a fair number of shameful practices and statuses that were attributed to them, including the inability to ride on horses, they had to ride on donkeys, they couldn't build their churches and their synagogues higher than mosques, and so on. All of these are classic concerns of honor and shame. As long as they accepted their position, they were protected. What were they protected from? They were protected from the violence of Muslims. So I wouldn't quite call it a protected status, but okay, that's how many people refer to it. So they developed this notion of the dhimmi. They also developed this notion of Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Islam being the realm of Islam, which is where Sharia rules, which is not the realm of peace, but the realm of submission. Granted, peace is one of the products of submission, but certainly not the kind of peace that we think of in terms of peace and freedom. And Dar al-Harb is the realm of the sword, and that's everywhere where infidels live not subject to the law of Sharia, not subject to Muslim law. And that means, obviously, the entire Christian world, and indeed all of the world that hadn't already been conquered by Islam. So we, infidels, who live in Dar al-Harb, are in fact, the term for us in Islam is not just infidel, but also harbi. Kharev is the Hebrew word for sword. Harbi means that we are those who are destined to the sword. So Islam, as part of its notion of itself as great and powerful and the only right, pure religious belief on the planet, has developed a whole set of attitudes towards the non-Muslim other, which are profoundly derogatory. Any term, infidel, actually the term kufar means he who conceals, who conceals the truth. And as I said, dhimmi means blameworthy. So the attitude of Muslims towards non-Muslims is historically profoundly negative and profoundly hostile. This idea of, Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Harb is in some senses a translation into religious language of a classic tribal, honor-shame, clan-based, solidarity-based attitude, which is our side right or wrong. So as a result, you have these powerful elements within Islam that, under conditions of modernity, are in crisis. And, what happened was that over time, the Muslims eventually conquered Constantinople in 1453, I believe, 1453, they conquered Constantinople. They then came into the Balkans. They got as far as the gates of Vienna. Previously, they had conquered in Western Europe almost up to France, but that was centuries earlier, and they were pushed back. So interestingly enough, 1453, they take Eastern Christianity. 1492, the Christians, the Catholics in Spain, kick them out of their last hold in Europe. And that victory on both sides, their victory was against the weaker part of Christianity. The stronger part of Christianity, which was the Western part, was on the rise. So ironically, in the year 1000, when Islam is part of the first world, Western Europe is at the bottom of the third world. This is a culture that is basically still a tribal culture. Its exports are not the exports of manufacture. Its exports are primary goods, whether it's wood or precious metals or other primary materials, including humans. The very term slave comes from Slav because the Christians were going into the pagan Northeast, into areas of the Slavic areas, and taking these blonde people down to the Mediterranean and selling them to the Muslims. Muslims like white slaves. So as a result, our term, the Latin term for slave is servus. And we get serf from that. But the word slave literally comes from this period where Europe was at the bottom of the third world and exporting even human raw material rather than anything manufactured. And then in the course of this last millennium, from 1000 to 2000, this is the topic that I work on, in the course of this millennium, Europe goes from strength to strength. It starts expanding literally from the 11th century onwards and continues to this day. And as a result, the Muslims who were still part of what you call a pre-modern world and were on top of the pre-modern world, all of a sudden discover that once the rules change with modernity, they're losing. And the real wake-up call was in 1798 when Napoleon invaded. And he invaded Egypt, and he took Egypt, and he moved up the course. He was the coast towards Istanbul. He was finally stopped at Acre. But there was no question that even abroad, the French forces were infinitely stronger than anything that the Arabs could put together. And that was the beginning of an awareness that something had gone wrong. And this notion that, we belong at the top of the world, but we're not. History has gone wrong. can be very powerful. It can really be depressing. I think both the English and the French feel this. The French, I think, in my analysis from the 11th century on, the French were sort of the leaders of the Western world. And then that was sort of taken away from them during the Industrial Revolution by the British. And both of them lost out by the end of the Second World War. And America took their place. And one of the things that you have here, and you know, France and England also are subject to the problems of honor shame, is the sense of resentment, the sense that, you know, this is no fair, I've been cheated. The success of America, or in the Muslim case, the success of the modern West, has deprived me of my greatness, and I must take vengeance. And so there's a fair level of a need for revenge on the part of the Muslims in order to restore their lost honor, their lost face. Their face has been blackened. And now the only way to wash a blackened face is through blood. So there's this enormous hostility, often can't express itself. This problem of being shamed by modernity for the Muslims reached an acute stage with Israel. Because here's this tiny people. The Jews historically have always been a people that have not fought, at least in the history of Islam, except for some of the early tribes that they fought. Jews have always been a subject people. They were a subject people in Christianity. They were a subject people in Islam. They were always at the bottom of the sort of hierarchy of groups. You know, the Greek Orthodox are at the top, and then you go down, and at the bottom are the Jews were always the lowliest, always considered cowardly and so on. And then all of a sudden, in 1948, the Arabs announced to the world that they're going to wipe out this new state, and they lose. And they lose on a massive scale. 7 Arab armies lose to a bunch of ragtag Jews who barely know how to fight. Many of them just come from the Holocaust, survivors of the Holocaust. And yet they lose on the world stage. And I would say that, you know, the Arabs, in particular the Palestinians, often use this expression, the Nakba, the catastrophe, to refer to what happened in 1948. And generally what they mean by it, or what they intend to mean by it, is the disaster that befell the Palestinians in 1948 as a result of this war. And originally when they used that, they used it to describe the way in which Arab elites had started the war and failed the Palestinians. So initially the term Nakba was used by Palestinians to criticize the Arabs, the Arab elites. Now it's used to criticize Israel, and you know, they say their claim is that 600,000 or 800,000 refugees were driven out of Israel by the Israelis and so on. Obviously, the historical record's more complicated than that, but that's their narrative. I think what really is going on with the Nakba is that it was an utter humiliation for the entire Arab world, including the Palestinians, and certainly for the Palestinian leadership. That it was the equivalent of somebody who considered themselves a world-class athlete being beaten by a girl. And in fact, being beaten by a girl, you know, who was wearing high heels or something. I mean, you know, just, it was a total catastrophe. And one of the ways they responded to that was to kick the Jews out of the Arab world. So the Iraqis, the Yemenis, the Taimanis, the Egyptians didn't do that. They did it in '67. But throughout the Arab world, the Syrians and so on, throughout the Arab world, all across North Africa, Jews were kicked out, and probably somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million Jews were kicked out of the Arab world. And it was an act of vengeance. It was an act of, we have been defeated, we are furious, and we will strike wherever we can. And of course, these Jewish populations were enormously vulnerable. So you have a number of pogroms, and then by and large, the Jews flee, leaving everything behind and so on. Again, it's important to understand that this issue of the humiliation of the existence of Israel has a double meaning. On the one hand, it's got this meaning that I just described, which you could argue is a sort of cultural meaning, the Jews against the Arabs, and it's a war, and the Arabs lost, and so on. But it's also a religious issue. Part of the self-image that Muslims have of themselves is that they are a religion that should dominate. And certainly it should dominate in what they consider Dar al-Islam. And Israel is right in the heart of Dar al-Islam. This has been part of the Muslim world since a generation after the Prophet died, even less than a generation. And it's always, with the exception of the Christian Crusaders for a brief period, it's always been in possession of the Muslims. And the Jews have always been dhimmi. So to have the Jews establish an autonomous state in the heart of Dar al-Islam, for there to be sovereign Jews in Dar al-Islam, is an unbelievable insult to Islam, at least to the form of Islam that believes that it must dominate. Certainly dominated Dar al-Islam, and then of course everything should be Dar al-Islam, so they should dominate. And that, I think, lies at the heart of the rejection. So I mentioned earlier the whole issue of Camp David and Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat could not say yes to Camp David. He could not openly acknowledge that the Jews were here to stay. He would have been giving up the last shred of Arab honor in this matter. And as he put it, when somebody once said to him, "Why didn't you say yes? What, you want me to be drinking tea with Sadat?" And that's what happened to Sadat. Sadat made peace with the Israelis, and he was assassinated. And he was assassinated by radical Muslims who, in fact, are part of the jihad that we're now dealing with today. So as a result, you've got a situation where, as far as the Muslims are concerned, it is a zero-sum conflict with Israel. There's no way that it can be resolved except by the elimination of Israel, which is itself a profound humiliation. It is a blackening of the face of Islam. It's a blasphemy against Allah, and only its disappearance can solve that. And I'm not saying there aren't Muslims who would like to say, look, let's get over this stuff and get on with our lives. And in fact, Israel can be a good neighbor, and we can acquire many things through the Israelis without going to the Europeans and so on. And there were Muslims who were saying that from the beginning of the Zionist movement. But the most violent and the most radical are the ones who must defend the honor of Islam, and in their mind, people who are Muslims who are willing to compromise are pretty much apostates. They have abandoned the true religion of Islam, and they deserve to die just as much as the Jews do. So I got to say, it's a very difficult situation. And again, to get back to this issue of cognitive egocentrism, it does not help us to find solutions to this problem by pretending that this is not the way they view things. And this is not, in particular, is not the way their leadership views things. I'd like to discuss the problem of the West's encounter with radical Islam end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century. Which I think is a process that's gone very badly for the West, and very well, not really for Muslims, but for radical Muslims, for jihadis. I think that by and large, they've gone from success to success, and the West has gone from one cultural disaster to another. So in order to understand the dynamics and possibly correct them, I'd like to go into some of these details. I think this approach that looks at the question of a crisis of Muslim honor also helps us understand global jihad. I've written a chapter on this in my book, Heaven on Earth, The Varieties of the Millennial Experience. And in it, one of the things I point out is that already starting in the 19th century, there were Muslim thinkers dealing with the problem of the modern West who viewed the challenge to Islam as a kind of apocalyptic war between good and evil, obviously Islam being good and the West being evil. Part of this comes from the sense that, and this is specifically true of Muslims for whom honor is everything, that the loss of their status as the most powerful and the most respected and the most honored and the most feared people on the planet, the loss of that status actually created literally an existential crisis. In other words, an Islam that is not dominant, and I'm not saying this is true of all Muslims, I'm saying it's true of these jihadis. An Islam that is not dominant is not Islam. What we consider a fair shake in modern civil society, which is, the separation of church and state, separation of church and state, you're free to practice your religion, but you're not free to impose it on others, to them is literally a blow at the heart of what Islam is about. So as a result, the rise of the West becomes an existential threat for them. And if you read the jihadi literature over and over again, there's no question in their minds that the West is trying to destroy Islam, that the West represents the destruction of Islam, that it is a mortal enemy and that mortal enemy must be defeated. So as a result, one of the things that arises, and it comes up particularly, I date the first phase of it to 1979-1980, which is the year that Khomeini took over in Iran, and which in the Muslim calendar is 1400, and they have a long tradition going all the way back to at least the year 200 of apocalyptic messianic expectations around the turn of their century. The previous one had been in 1882, which is when the Mahdi in Khartoum took over and defeated Lord Kitchener, and there's even a movie about it with Laurence Olivier. But in any case, 1979 is the beginning of a global jihad in which the goal is to take over the entire world. It's world domination. I'm not saying all Muslims are part of this, although I think that any Muslim who does not believe that Islam should dominate the world at some point is a fairly modern Muslim who is challenging some very strong traditions within Islam. But for these jihadis, there was no question that it was, now is the time. That's what I call apocalyptic, the belief that now is the time for the dramatic transformation. And the millennial goal is the global caliphate or global Sharia. Muslims dominate everybody else in the world. This is a very powerful belief. It motivates a great deal of behavior. And it's something that, again, we as cognitive egocentrists find difficult to believe. In particular, if you talk to Jews, it's really interesting because the Nazis accused the Jews of wanting to conquer the world and enslave mankind. Jews will say, well, we can't accuse the Muslims of wanting to do this because we didn't like it when it was done to us, so we shouldn't be doing it to them. It makes no difference to them, or they're not interested, or at least they say they're not interested in whether it's true or not. It wasn't true of the Jews, but it is true of the jihadis. And ironically, like Hitler, the jihadis who have plans for world conquest accuse the Jews of wanting world conquest, which is a classic piece of projection. So we're in a situation where we have an enemy, very clear enemy, who plans the destruction of democratic society, which they see as corrupt, immoral, homosexuals. One of the signs of the end is that women talk back. So this is a misogynist culture. It's a homophobic culture. It's against equal rights for everybody. It's only for Muslims. And so on. I mean, Islam has both gender and religious apartheid laws. in which the female gender and non and infidels are systematically inferior before the law. They can't give testimony in court. They can't bring cases in court against Muslims, etc. Okay, so with this situation, we are faced with a really remorseless enemy. I mean, this is not, there's no compromise here. These people are fighting the ultimate battle against the ultimate evil, and we are that ultimate evil, and no matter how nice we are. Now, one of the things that's involved in this is, of course, you know, Muslims, the jihadis, certainly in 1979 or 80 or 90, all these people have problems because they're not numerous enough, and there's no way they can take the West on militarily. So they have to do it in other ways. I'll get into some of them in a moment. But one of the things, and we saw this already when we discussed what happened in 48, which is when they're frustrated, when they feel that they've been humiliated and they need to take vengeance, and they can't take vengeance on the people that they want to take vengeance on, they take vengeance on the people who can't fight back. So in 48, they took vengeance on the Jews and kicked them out, and now they're going after the Christians. And the state of Christians in the Muslim world today is lamentable. The only place in the entire Middle East where Christians are safe is Israel and possibly pockets of Lebanon. But other than that, the attacks on Christians in Egypt, the attacks on the Copts in Iraq, the attacks on the not just the Christians, but also groups like the Yazidi and stuff, is absolutely terrifying. Really vicious stuff, you know, crucifixion, enslavement of children, massacre of men, torture, and so on. Really, really ferocious stuff. And, you know, for reasons that continue to puzzle me to this day, the West, including the Pope, says almost nothing in defense of these people, and certainly doesn't do anything in defense of these people. But in any case, this radicalization that I think is becoming stronger and stronger all the time has placed the Christians in the Middle East in terrible danger. And of course, only their ability to defend themselves protects the Jews from suffering the same fate. So this jihadi force, I think the most important thing for Westerners to understand about the jihadis is they are perfectly aware that they cannot win the military battle against the West now. Now, most Westerners respond to that by saying, duh, it's so obvious that they can't conquer the West that they're not trying. It's a ridiculous idea. You're accusing them of something that they would never think because they can't be that stupid. And therefore, you must be the Islamophobe for telling me that they want to conquer the world and destroy Western democracy. You're paranoid. You're the one who's making this stuff up. You're the warmonger, and they're actually just defending themselves. Well, in their minds, they're defending themselves, but their definition of themselves is they're defending the people who should dominate the world. Now, what happens as a result is the jihadis, in order to succeed, need to conduct a first phase of the war against the West, which is not necessarily a military war, although it has components like the strike on 9/11 and 7/7 in London, and the strike on the Barcelona trains and so on. There are incidents where it attacks the West, but these are guerrilla acts, terrorist acts. They're incidental, they're small. They're not the main theater of war. The main theater of war is cognitive. And in the cognitive theater of war, what they need to do is to convince the West not to resist. They need to convince the West that as they invade, as they move in, and as they take over, the West not identify what they're doing as a hostile act, but in fact concede consistently to the demands that they make. And we discussed earlier the issue of the Charlie Hebdo and the Muhammad cartoons. Well, you know, that goes back to Salman Rushdie in 1989 when Khomeini put out a fatwa against Salman Rushdie, who was living in Dar al-Harb and who had written a book which offended Khomeini. Not that he had read it, but he heard enough to know that it was offensive. And so he puts out this fatwa, and because there are Muslims in England, and because even, you know, a percent of the Muslims in Europe is still enough crazy people who might assassinate Salman Rushdie or anybody associated with the publication of his book. I believe his Japanese translator was killed. The West realized that they were in threat. And in fact, very few Western intellectuals really supported Salman Rushdie. He had to go into hiding. And by and large, it's not at one of the prouder periods in Western intellectual history. And what was actually happening there was the extension of Sharia law to Dar al-Harb. And the same thing's going on with the Muhammad cartoons. They're insisting that we follow a rule, which isn't even true of all Muslims, but is true of the stricter Muslims, that says you shouldn't do a picture of Muhammad. Why? Because it might lead to idol worship. Well, we're not in danger of idol worship. We're certainly not worshiping Muhammad as an idol. So that's a stricture that actually is something that applies to Muslims. They're applying it to us, and they're not applying it to us because they're worried about the state of our souls. They're applying it to us because they want us to submit to their rules. So they have now extended this rule to us, and not just us within the Muslim world, but us in the non-Muslim world as well. And our reaction has been to say, oh, well, it upsets them, let's not do it. And as a result, this is a huge cognitive war victory. This is a huge, basically, it has established a precedent in which the West concedes to extremist demands on the part of Muslims so as not to upset the Muslims. And I think it's set up a situation in which repeatedly they can push for things in which we will concede. And one of those things is this notion of Islamophobia. This is a notion that was developed by members of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States in the 1990s. It's now one of the most powerful memes out there. Anybody who criticizes Islam is labeled an Islamophobe. It's the equivalent of being a racist. It's the equivalent of being a terrible person. It's the equivalent of being a right-wing warmonger. And as a result of that, everybody is terrified of having that label applied to them. There's no doubt in my mind that the people who apply Islamophobia as a way to stop anybody from criticizing Islam will say that what I'm saying right now is Islamophobic. Actually, I think there are plenty of Muslims who do not fit the description that I've given. I've been describing the jihadis, the radicals, the Islamists, the ones who believe that Islam must dominate everybody else. However, the way in which those very people have been able to deploy Islamophobia as a way to prevent anybody from talking about that is actually a perfect example of the cognitive war victory of the jihadis over the West. And as a result, we're in a terrible situation. And one of the ways that you can see that terrible situation is that we are systematically pressured into cooperating with people who claim that they are moderates when they're not. They're still in pursuit of Islamic domination. They're still in pursuit of the honor of Islam, which they define as domination. They don't use violence, and they insist that as long as they don't use violence, we identify them as moderate. And that happened during the Arab Spring. I mean, we had, there was a discussion that never really got started about what would happen in Egypt if there were elections. And the people who said the Muslim Brotherhood's going to take over were branded Islamophobes. And instead, the TVs and the newspapers were constantly interviewing specialists largely of the Saadian variety, who are saying, oh, no, 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 this is democracy, this is wonderful, we've been waiting for this, it's finally come, now everything's good. And those people who weren't about the Muslim Brotherhood are Islamophobes. And we even had the head of our intelligence, national security, claiming that the Muslim Brotherhood was largely secular, which is a staggering piece of cognitive egocentrism, and our Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, saying they were largely moderate. And that was based on the fact that they hadn't killed any infidels in the last 10 years. So all of a sudden they become moderate. Once they took over, it became clear that they weren't moderate. But when your foreign policy is decided on an application of your cognitive egocentrism, which is systematically being abused and exploited by the jihadis, you're in trouble. And that you is us, the West, not just Israel, the West.